For over 39 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke with BILD Situation Room. And we start with images of the nightly Russian terror against Ukrainian civilians, this time footage from Odessa in the southwest. Once again, many wounded, numerous damaged homes, especially in the historic old town. These are images from 2 days ago. Last night wasn't as severe as the Russians in just the first 2 days fired over 800 terror drones, specifically large kamikaze drones of the Geran 2 type, at Ukraine. Thus, we can clearly observe the impacts of these attacks on Odessa, another major city. We must not forget that it's not just in the east of the country where intense fighting is taking place in Dnipro or Kharkiv, nor in the north where Kiev is attacked almost every night, but also here in the south where Odessa has frequently been a key target of Russian kamikaze drone strikes. And we have new footage showing us how the defenders of Odessa are trying to stop these large kamikaze drones, ideally just before impact. And we'll also take a look at the map shortly to see why there's so much activity for Ukraine's drone defense around Odessa or the greater Odessa area. First, we'll see the footage from last night, and these are all images from the Browning, the heavy machine guns, which are used mostly by the Ukrainian side on off-road vehicles, sometimes also stationary. And they're all firing at these incoming Geran 2 drones. You can see it relatively well by the delta shape. It's essentially a flying wing design, which was first developed and produced in Iran. It was built there starting in 2021 or 2022, delivered to the Russians in 2022, and has been mass-produced ever since then. And now we're seeing essentially how it's being shot at with the heavy machine gun, and we're also repeatedly seeing hits. That means it's indeed the case that the drone is being hit here, essentially losing control, and crashes into the sea, I believe exactly. We can clearly observe that a significant portion of these drones are being successfully taken down. We also observe in these recordings that frequently, when the payload is struck mid-air, explosions happen directly in the sky above. If just the avionics are hit or only the wings are struck, then the drones end up plummeting and crashing down to the ground before they explode. Nonetheless, we can see that it's really 200, 300 drones per night that are being shot down, and Ukraine manages to take down about 75% of them. To shoot them down before they reach their targets. Why is this happening? Hundreds of teams from the Ukrainian Air Force and Defense Forces are actively engaged, who spend every night shooting down these drones. You really have to picture it. These are the individuals doing this day in and day out. That's their full-time job. These soldiers sleep during the day, and every single night they're wide awake, constantly on high alert to spot these Russian drones in the final moments and then bring them down from the sky. We also want to take a close look at the map and see why so many drones are arriving in the Odessa area. On one hand, the city itself, as mentioned, is a crucial target of the Russian army's terror attacks, mainly because it stands as Ukraine's last remaining deep-sea port. That means many goods arrive there and grain continues to be shipped from there across the Black Sea, which is also why Russia repeatedly attacks the port, but also the old town, as we saw, and surrounding residential areas. But Odessa's not the only target. Many drones launched from Crimea also fly over it, have to pass through this region to then continue onward toward Kiev or the western part of the country. These are additional reasons why Odessa's defenders are so overwhelmed. Not only do they have to fend off attacks on the city itself, but they're also continuously occupied with handling, essentially defending the rest of Ukraine from Odessa. And it's not just Russia deploying drones, but Ukraine as well. Long-range drones specifically target military, not civilian objectives. We have new Nizhny-Kamsk footage. We'll take a look soon on the map, approximately 1,100 kilometers away from the Ukrainian border. This footage reveals yet another attempt by Ukraine to target, in this particular case, a Geran 2 factory using a drone strike. It's located in this specific area. Here's the drone, a bit hard to spot due to its small size, flying from our perspective over to the right. And what we're currently observing is an attempt by the Russian air defense to intercept this drone using a missile. And once more we see, that's exactly why so many Ukrainian kamikaze drones manage to get through. Why does this happen? Well, it's because a lot of Russian rockets just don't have the necessary quality to make an effective strike here. We can see it here. Now we've just observed it, the explosion of the Russian rocket, while the Ukrainian drone continues to manage and hold up quite well. It simply keeps flying, seemingly unharmed by what we just witnessed, continuing on its path. We don't know if it ended up crashing or if it was shot down or fell out of the sky afterward. Again, we see the Russians using air defense like missiles inland against Ukrainian drones. However, as in this case, they often miss their targets. And that's the reason why we now almost every morning have the situation of Russian factories burning or exploding. Also this morning, it's yet another explosives factory, though only 500 kilometers from Ukraine, that was hit last night and has been exploding since early this morning. Nizhnekamsk is another spot we're checking on the map to see just how far Ukrainian drones have managed to go. And we can see it clearly here, a truly long-range strike that was successfully executed just yesterday as planned. As I mentioned earlier, it's more than 1,100 kilometers from the border. It's also worth noting that the drone was likely not taken down directly from this immediate area right along the border. It's extremely dangerous near the front line, but based on our experience, it's still about 100 to 200 kilometers further back. You can manage the whole thing without Russian surveillance drones filming it and then missile attacks following. Thus, it's entirely possible the distance was even greater, reaching into the Sumy and Chernihiv regions, which would exceed 1,300, 1,400 kilometers. But Ukrainian drones have now reached the capability to cover those vast distances effectively. From Russia, we now head back to Ukraine, where Russian forces are intensifying their efforts to advance on the ground, particularly along the border between the Donetsk region in the east and the Dnipropetrovsk region in central Ukraine. We have new footage showing that the Russians are indeed making a forceful attempt to advance, and doing so quickly, just as we've seen repeatedly over the past days and weeks. On motorcycles. So we're seeing Russian motorcycles all over the place here, moving relatively quickly along these dirt paths, all heading west, all towards the Dnipro region, and the footage, as mentioned, is from Novomykolaivka, which we'll take a closer look at on the map in just a moment right over here. And we're seeing the Russians. Moving swiftly is absolutely essential. They know that the Ukrainians have a huge problem when it comes to infantry, that they no longer have cohesive defensive lines, but rather in various spots within. These forest areas, they occasionally have small positions. They aim to break through and establish a foothold behind. However, we also see that the Ukrainians repeatedly attack these fast motorcycle advances with drones, also with mines, and are trying here in Novomykhailivka to halt the Russian advance. And directly in the neighboring village, just about a kilometer further north in Novoselivka, Ukrainian forces have also been actively attempting to push the Russians back on the ground. We'll show it on the map shortly. We're in Donetsk's final villages right before the fighting shifts toward, they call it Potausk, where the fighting would shift. These Ukrainians are currently in the neighboring village of Novozahivka, working to push the Russians back, as much of the area has already been occupied by them. And once again, we can see that this is not a classic reconquest mission, but rather another search and destroy operation. You go in, locate the Russians, eliminate them, and then retreat as quickly as possible to survive the night, fully aware that the Russians will inevitably pursue, that they're constantly sending in fresh infantry. So as we've already said, we're seeing the images here from Novoshahivka, and in the end, I can fast forward a bit, we also see how, by the end of the day, after the operation was effectively concluded by the Ukrainian special forces, we see them pulling back. How they then begin their retreat and, in the final stages, exit the area in an off-road vehicle, most likely heading back to Dnipropetrovsk, where they will regroup and prepare for their next mission. And here we see it again, the whole situation being difficult because, well, the Ukrainians are on the ground, they have infantry, but it's precisely these units that have to hold the position there, who are really trying to hold a front there, but there are extremely few of them, so few that the Russians can keep advancing further and further. We're taking a closer look at all of this on the map, seeing where the footage we just saw came from. As mentioned, here's Dnipropetrovsk, a major central Ukrainian region. Here's Donetsk, and we already saw yesterday that to the north of Horishov, the Russians crossed the Oblast border. Here, they made it across for the first time. The footage we just saw was taken in Novopavlivka and the neighboring small village, capturing the ongoing events currently unfolding in those specific areas. And there as well, the Russians are trying to push forward. That means they're attempting to build up a broad front here, about 10 to 15 kilometers wide, in order to attack Novopavlivka on one side and next, of course, the town of Mikhailivka. Especially for Mikhailivka, just like all the cities currently under attack, it's a genuine disaster given that several thousand civilians still remain in the area. The city has barely faced attacks in recent months and years. It's still mostly intact, and now the Ukrainians there likely have to brace themselves for the worst to come, that they may have to flee, given that the Russians are pushing further forward, in this case into central Ukraine. And we've just observed that the Russian army isn't advancing with tanks as often as in previous months, but is relying more heavily on motorcycles instead. This has ultimately resulted in, according to the assessments made by observers and experts, only around 33 vehicles being lost last week, specifically heavy military equipment, within the time frame of just a single week. That is a very low number, something that was sometimes seen in a single day, and the Russians have indeed changed their strategy. They realized that if we attack with these tanks, if we drive them straight to the front lines, the Ukrainians are quite effective at targeting us with kamikaze drones and ultimately succeeding in destroying the tanks. That's why they're being more cautious with their tanks, and that's where we're seeing new material which further confirms that. Ironically, the whole thing is propaganda material from the Russian army, aiming to showcase their so-called wonder tank, the T-90M, essentially the best tank Russia has in mass production. It's now at the front and it's being deployed. However, what these recordings actually reveal is that the tank is no longer being effectively utilized as a tank at all, but as protected artillery, engaging targets from a significant distance away. Even the publishers of this video from the Russian army make absolutely no attempt to conceal it whatsoever. We can see here that the barrel is positioned at an extreme angle. We'll also see it from other perspectives shortly, showing that it's set up from 10 kilometers away, as they themselves indicate. From a distance of 10 kilometers, it's targeting Ukrainian positions near Lyman, essentially no longer utilizing the tank for its intended purpose, but rather as a mobile artillery piece. And we can take a look at the whole situation and see just how unbelievably ineffective it all really is. So here's the first explosion that we're seeing right now, and now somehow the second explosion. Let's take a look at it. The smoke from earlier, here's the second explosion. Easily 50-60 meters apart, and we can see it happening right in the middle of the field. There are no Ukrainian forces there. That means an actual battle tank is being deployed here as an artillery piece, which then accordingly leads to significant impact on the area. Leads to it being completely ineffective in what it does. But the Russians are afraid that if they send this tank closer than 10 kilometers to the border, to the front lines, if they even use it for troop transport, then all these nets we see here won't help at all, but the Ukrainians will manage with their drones to completely destroy these armored vehicles. And here's something quite interesting, similar to the Ukrainians. The tank typically hides underground. First, it's positioned inside this large shelter, and in the end, it drives back into it for protection, which means it's essentially shoot and scoot, something we used to see with artillery, and now supposedly the best Russian tank is doing it. Another video we'd like to take a closer look at, shared by Ukrainian units, highlights a new Russian kamikaze drone in action. And this drone is especially insidiously designed, as we can clearly observe it here during its flight. It's called the V2U, and the special thing about it is that it apparently operates with AI, meaning it can automatically locate its targets. And there's no one left to oversee the process anymore. That means there's no operator to ultimately determine, for example, whether it's a military or civilian target. But the drone flies 50 kilometers behind the front and strikes a target without any discrimination. That means it doesn't differentiate at all between civilian and military. It simply strikes whatever it targets. And in this sense, these drones are responsible, among other things, for the recent deadly attacks on buses carrying civilians in the Sumy region over the past few weeks. And we are now witnessing here how one of these drones is effectively intercepted by Ukraine, which deploys a small FPV drone to track, pursue, and ultimately bring it down with precise accuracy. Here we see once more, just before impact, how they are constructed, essentially a biplane-like design. And the special thing here at the front, we can see this camera inside, as well as the AI alongside the warhead mechanism, so next to the explosive. This means that this drone is essentially designed to fly as far into Ukrainian territory as possible and then hit any target. That means it's pure terror because it's not aiming at anything specific like a tank or any sort of military target at all whatsoever. But it's simply launched into a broad region, and then at some point the AI takes control and autonomously handles the entire approach process completely on its own. And it's really quite interesting since Ukraine is also using German AI drones, specifically kamikaze drones. But the difference is that a human logs the target, you fly into the target area, then you see it's a military objective, and that's logged and then attacked. And not like the Russians, where you just say, yeah, drone, you handle it. No matter what's moving back there, whether it's a bus or a tank, you just fly in and destroy it. And on the topic of drones, let's take a look at one final video which shows that Ukraine is now also relying on fiber optics and how these fiber optic drones can be used with extreme precision. Here we have a video from the Kursk region, which is located once again in the western part of Russia today. And we see here how a Typhoon K system, a mine-protected vehicle, is being attacked, which is actually extremely well sheltered and heavily fortified, making it a challenging target. We now see this hangar, which only had a very small opening at the top of the door. And now we see essentially how the drone flies in here and how one after another various drones attack this Typhoon K vehicle. We've already had the first explosion, and now we see it being attacked again. Here you can see the vehicle. The quality is a bit poor, but hopefully you can make it out. This is truly a high-tech vehicle, at least a very well-protected, mine-resistant, wheel-driven vehicle of the Russian army, which is now being attacked inside this hangar. Which means, as we've been saying over the past few weeks, the idea of deploying these Russian fiberglass drones in the first place, this led the Ukrainians to say, okay, if you're doing it with 1,000, then we have to do it too. And this in turn has resulted in much of the Russian logistics, which were previously safe behind the front lines, now being vulnerable to attack.